Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Megan Opria, managing editor of the Texas National Security Review. In this episode, we have the first of a two-part discussion about the national security dimensions of food insecurity with former UT Chancellor and former Commander of Special Operations Command, retired Admiral William McCraven, and Congressman Michael McCall, chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security. Moderating this discussion is Chris Tomlinson of the Houston Chronicle. This event took place at the University of Texas at Austin. It was sponsored by the Clements Center and Strauss Center and was co-sponsored by the LBJ School and the Innovations for Peace and Development. I hope you enjoyed their discussion and tune in for part 2 and more episodes of Horns of a Dilemma.
We'd like to start with some opening remarks, first from Congressman McCall.
No, thanks, Chris, and thanks to the LBJ School for this invitation. It's always an honor to be here and also to be in the presence of a hero of mine, Admiral McCraven, who I consider to be a friend as well. And we thank you for what you've done for the nation. Sure. Everybody knows what you did. I think to Chris's point, poverty breeds conflict and conflict breeds poverty. It's a vicious circle. And when I get my threat briefings in the Capitol in a classified sense, we go around the world as chairman of Homeland Security. Where are the hot spots out there? And it's a lot of the countries you mentioned. It's Yemen, also it's Somalia with Al-Shabaab popping up. It's Nigeria with Boko Haram. It's frankly Syria, Northern Africa, and the whole Sahel region in Africa, I believe, is vulnerable to extremism because of the impoverished conditions. And to your point, I think it is getting worse. I can read the numbers off. But in some of these countries, almost half the population, and in some 2/3 of the population, are in what's called food insecurity. And that breeds political insecurity, and it breeds terrorism and extremism. So I think these issues really work hand in glove. And I think policymakers and certainly the military, State Department need to be aware of this and work as a one government and with the USAID and the NGOs to tackle this worldwide epidemic that we're seeing right now. And it's also in our hemisphere in Venezuela right now. We got a huge refugee crisis taking place. They said the average Venezuelan lost 22 pounds last year because of the food conditions. So I look forward to this very interesting conversation and of course, being here with the Admiral. Thank you.
Admiral McCraven.
Well, thanks, Chris, and let me also thank Congressman McCall for your service, sir. It's been great working with you when I was in uniform, and I've enjoyed our friendship since my time here at UT. There was a great book by Bob Kaplan, Robert Kaplan, back in 2012 called "The Revenge of Geography," and it kind of starts off with the premise that everybody thinks we're kind of coming into this virtual world where you have online shopping, and when your social networks are built around social media, and your IP address is critically important. But of course, what Kaplan points out is it's all about terrain. And since the history of mankind, it has always been about terrain and the environment that surrounds the populations. And I'll tell you, that was really brought home to me when I was in Afghanistan, even more so than Iraq. Place called the Korengal Valley up in the Konar province. And as you go into this kind of long stretch of valley in the Hindu Kush, the first thing you ask yourself is why in the world would people live here when there are better places to live? But the Afghans have been living in the Korengal Valley for thousands of years since Alexander came into Afghanistan. And you find that there are 4 things that drive why people live there. First, it is the security. It is a defendable valley from the standpoint of the people that are there. Second, it has an access point. It has a road. It is also a place where they can have a certain amount of sustainable food, and of course there is water. And so as you begin to look at the things that drive populations, water and food security are the 2 primary things. And it is interesting as we try to look towards the future, we sometimes dismiss the importance of these things. But when you think about water, and you think about 97% of the Earth's water is salty. 3% of it. So you got about 2% that is either in the polar ice caps or it's in dams or it's in aquifers. So about 1% of the world's water is really drinkable. And it is also 1% of the world's water that people fight over. So that water, of course, is also part of what sustains the food security. So I will tell you, from the standpoint of a military man and somebody that understands national security, it is all connected. The terrain is connected. The water is connected. The food security is connected. And I think as we begin to look at the future of how we deal with food security, we need to understand these impacts. I guess I'll leave you with one final thing. You know, when I think about global food security, you think again about terrain, you think about politics that Chris talked about, you think about culture and environment. So when I think about terrain, if you take a look at Yemen, for example, in Yemen, they have a water shortage that is probably unparalleled in the world. Part of that is because they plant khat, and khat is a narcotic that the Yemenis chew on. But the problem with khat is it is a plant that absorbs a lot of water. So a little bit like the economics and the incentives of the poppies in Afghanistan, the reason the Afghans grew poppies is because they couldn't make any money off the cauliflower. The reason people grow khat, even though it takes up all the water, is because, of course, it is incentivized through the cost of the khat. The politics, there are some places around the world where as much as USAID, Americans in the international community want to help, people don't want our help because the politics is such that they're not happy to have boxes of USAID stamped with the stars and bars on it. There is the issue of culture. We talk about this dilemma of certain populations where they're both malnourished and obese. And frankly, here in Texas, we have some of those problems, where the nature of the culture is that they are high salt, high fat, high sugar content that make the young men and women obese and yet are not good for nutrition. And then, of course, there is the whole problem of climate change and the environment. So I think as we look at the future, we really do have to think about global food security. We have to think about water security. And I think you do this by recognizing that it is a problem that the nation states have got to deal with, the international community has to deal with. It is about education. It is about infrastructure. And I think it is about incentivizing good behavior. And that is a challenge, particularly when your life is about making $1 off a poppy crop or a potato or cauliflower crop. It's hard to incentivize good behavior, but it's something we need to accept that challenge and move forward with it. So thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Congressman, as the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee and a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, are your fellow members of Congress talking enough about these issues? How do they come up? Is it, my profession will never bring this up in this current political environment. I'm hoping that smarter people behind closed doors are having these conversations. What can you tell us about Washington?
And I think they are, particularly on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think there's a tendency running for office to say foreign aid is a waste of money and let's cut it. And that's an easy political slogan. I think it could be reformed, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think when the administration proposed a 20% cut to foreign aid, that was met with resistance by the Congress, if that makes you feel any better. Because I think, as General Mattis said, and he gave us a little bit of cover, he said, if you do that, we're just got to make more bullets. And he's right. I mean, we can reform foreign aid, and I think the Global Fragility Act that I introduced will take on the way state, DOD, and USAID work together as a unity of government, because right now they're at all different purposes, cross purposes, and have them work together. So we can reform the way we do this. But I think an absolute 20% cut across the board would be dangerous because these nations would get worse, not better. And then the threat of terrorism and extremism will get great and not better. And so I think those conversations, we've had, I enjoy it actually on my committee, great bipartisanship. Almost, I'd say 99% of my bills have passed unanimously. And the Foreign Affairs Committee, I think, enjoys the same sort of bipartisanship because we see national security as not a Republican-Democrat issue, but an American issue. And they don't check our party affiliation when we go overseas. When we go overseas, quite a bit to see these countries, to see what needs to be addressed. And I don't know where ISIS is now with the fall of the caliphate. I've seen the rise and fall of it. We're not quite sure where they're going. We think Euphrates. We think they may be headed back to northern Africa and the Sahel region, which is not good for Africa. And the more impoverished and lack of governance that you have, which is what we had in Afghanistan. We had a complete breakdown and lack of governance, as you saw when you were embedded over there. And it's those safe havens, like what we saw in Iraq and Syria after that conflict. When you have a vacuum and lack of governance, it's going to be filled by countries like Iran or radical extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So I think this is a whole of government approach we need to be taking a look at. We did pass the Global Food Security Act, which provides, and it was bipartisan, provides $1 billion in assistance for food security and also malnutrition, which kind of reminds me of when we passed PEPFAR, a decade ago that dealt with the AIDS epidemic. I think there's an apparatus in place with, say, PEPFAR that we can do other things with.
Well, let me ask you about a piece of legislation you have pending, the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act. It's been endorsed by 39 aid agencies. And if you could explain more about what you're asking for, because it seems like you're asking USAID, DOD, the State Department to kind of rethink their whole approach. Is that right?
And this would be the reforming of foreign aid. Not saying a 20% blanket cut, but how can we perform better with the money that the Congress appropriates? And I think, it's just like before 9/11. If the FBI is not working with the CIA or the DOD, get a breakdown in communication. Same thing with foreign aid. I mean, why isn't the DOD and the State Department and USAID working more in concert together rather than what could be at cross purposes? That could provide a more effective and efficient use of our tax dollars and a way to reform it rather than slash it.
Admiral, in Djibouti, we have the Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa. I spent a lot of time with them over the years with 3 different commanders. And I noticed that there was this constant dynamic where every ambassador in the region was expecting the Joint Task Force to take care of everything. Right. You had the money, the DOD had the money, DOD had the troops. I watched soldiers inoculate cattle, drill water wells. I talk about oil in my regular job, so there are other kinds of wells. Is that too much pressure on the Pentagon to have to be not only the warfighting arm, but also the humanitarian arm of the government? Do we need to rethink that?
Well, the military has done humanitarian aid since there was a military. I mean, you think about the Berlin airlift when you go back even the last century. But the fact of the matter is, in Africa, we have a very concerted effort with the State Department in how we distribute humanitarian aid. And the reason the military does it, of course, is because we have the resources, because we have the lift capability with the helicopters. We've got the ships bring it in, they bring it into a port. We've got the lift with the helicopters or small airplanes to get it to a remote location where it needs to, or we go by convoy. So the State Department doesn't have those kind of resources. But I can tell you, in every single country in Africa or anywhere we do this, the first stop a military commander makes is to the ambassador's office, to sit down with the ambassador, to sit down with the ambassador's team and say, where do you need this humanitarian assistance delivered? Now, obviously, if it's a crisis, if it's a tsunami in Indonesia, if it's a typhoon in the Philippines or an earthquake in Pakistan, the military comes in pretty quickly. But if it is a deliberate, long-term process, then it is a thoughtful plan where the host country, really in concert with the ambassador, decides where that aid's going to go. And then we in the military provide that aid and provide those resources to get them out to the hinterlands. The reason that's important is it gets back to stability. You don't want a fragile, unstable country. That's not good for anybody. So finding out where those hotspots are, and USAID has a fragility index. So they can tell you every country in the world and why it's fragile, where it is most fragile, and how to address that fragility. And so, again, working with the State Department, that's what the military does. It's been a very successful partnership. Is it It is not without its controversy. It is not without its friction, because the military sometimes sees the opportunity also, frankly, to get out in places where the bad guys are. So there is a dynamic between the military commander and the ambassador. The ambassador says, look, I want to bore or dig boreholes here in Niger. And we say, great, we're happy to do that, but we'd like to also get up where the Tuaregs are so we can kind of see what's happening up there. And again, it's a great discussion, deliberation, but at the end of the day, the State Department makes the decision on where we exercise that humanitarian assistance.
So you're comfortable with the balance because AID used to contract with NGOs and other aid agencies to do a lot of this work. Some military commanders are concerned that making that shift from a humanitarian operation into warfighting and then back again to a peacekeeping operation is difficult. And frankly, a lot of the Africans I spoke to were a little offended by the force protection, right. The guards that would go out to protect the veterinarians and the engineers who were providing the aid.
Yeah, again, it's a difficult balance at times. So again, let's take Niger or Chad or Nigeria. A lot of times the U.S. military does in fact contract with locals because to your point, we understand the dynamics on the ground. And the last thing you want to do is have a soldier in battle dress uniform showing up at a far-end location. That doesn't serve anybody well. So you take U.S. government money, you contract with the locals in support of the State Department to get the humanitarian aid there. Now, frankly, sometimes, as I said, when the devastating earthquake hit Pakistan back in 2010 or thereabouts, there was concern from the Pakistani government. They didn't want American military in uniform delivering aid. But at the end of the day, they had to save these folks up near the Kashmir area, and the only way to get aid there was through MH-47 helicopters with folks in uniform. And the Pakistanis did the right thing and allowed us to come in. But it is always a challenge and it is always a difficult balance. And then again, at the end of the day, we'll defer to what the State Department and the host nation think is the appropriate way to tackle the problem.
Chairman, you passed the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Act. Mm-hmm. And that kind of addresses this interaction between, when to use aid workers in T-shirts, when to use troops, and the overlap between counterterrorism and food security, right?
Yeah, and it's primarily directed at the Sahel. Again, that's where the big counterterrorism effort is playing out. And I think to the Admiral's point, state and military sort of play hand in glove. I was in Afghanistan when they had our military as basically humanitarian assistance providers. I think to some extent I agree with you. The population views that as this guy in a uniform with sort of intimidating looking presence. So it's a delicate balance. How you do this, but I think again, Matt has said something to the effect of the military's job is to apply maximum pressure so the diplomats can do their job, and I think that if you're trying to define the rules, that's really. But you go back to the Marshall Plan, my dad's war, World War II. One of the best things we did was provide that airlift assistance that didn't recreate the conditions after World War I, and I think that's where a lot of this stems. Would the average soldier rather be fighting terrorists, or would you rather be a humanitarian worker? I think you'd probably be rather fighting terrorists, but it's a delicate balance.
Well, again, I think you're right, sir. When you look back about the Berlin airlift and the rebuilding of Europe after World War II, and frankly, the rebuilding of Japan after World War II. What we found out, of course, is both the Europeans and the Japanese became our closest allies because of the way we handled that reconstruction. So the military, to your point, we know how to do reconstruction. It is the same Corps of Engineers that build the dams and the levees can help with the reconstruction. The same kids that do the fighting can help in the small villages in Afghanistan and Iraq build schools and do other things like that. So the skill set, interestingly enough, is not that different. In the Philippines several years ago, typhoon comes through and really has a devastating effect on the Philippines. The first people in were the Special Operations Forces. The reason they were the first people in is because we had MC-130 airplanes that could get into remote fields in order to bring in the Air Force combat controllers that could set up a tower so that we could bring in other airlift in order to provide the Filipino population food and water. Well, that couldn't be done except with a Special Operations Force that, if called upon, within a moment's notice could turn into a fighting force. But the skills that allow us to be superb soldiers are similar skills that allow us to be superb humanitarians.
I think where it plays best is in these hot spots where you want the humanitarian assistance, you want to provide stability, but it's so dangerous that you need the security forces there to protect State Department and the NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's been a lot of talk about cutting foreign aid. The State Department's never been smaller than it is today, or at least not in recent history. China is beginning to fill a void that we once filled. They're the ones that are building roads now. They're the ones that are building ports. They're really competing with us for influence. Are you concerned about that?
Very concerned, and whether it's foreign counterintelligence briefings or State Department, China, with their one belt, one road policy, it's 2025 vision to dominate the world both militarily and economically. And in the cyberspace, as the Admiral knows, they're stealing billions of dollars, if not trillions, in intellectual property, military technology transfers. This is pretty serious stuff. And the espionage, 20 million security clearances stolen, including ours, sitting here from China. But they are influencing the region now, and they're winning. They will go into these African nations and exploit them with high leverage loans. They first bribe them with a suitcase of cash, and we'll build a soccer stadium for you if you'll let us come in. And then they over leverage them. They bring their own workers in from China, not the host nation in Africa. They extract their natural resources, and then they essentially default on the loan, and China's there to take it over like they did in Sri Lanka and Djibouti. They have a base now in Djibouti where we have one. So this is getting, to me, and they do it, sort of in a deceptive way when they move in. And that's the competition, I think, for the African continent. I had dinner with 8 ambassadors last month, and I said, well, why do you do business with the Chinese? They're just exploiting you. And their answer was very simply, because you're not there. American interests are not there. I'm working on a bill with the Undersecretary of Economics to get our ambassadors, not just from a diplomacy role, but rather advancing our economic interests in the region. This is where I think OPIC has a role to play. And I know the president now, he's taking over our Overseas Private Investment Corporation, can supplant our foreign aid by investing overseas in projects that can bring a real return on our investment, while at the same time our influence abroad and helping stabilize these countries, particularly the ones in the African continent.
Admiral, famously, we had the Battle of Mogadishu that really kind of forced the Clinton administration to rethink its humanitarian intervention. I was based in Rwanda right after the genocide, and people there talk about the lack of U.S. intervention in that crisis, and the President Clinton later apologized for that. Can you speak a little bit to what the military has learned over the years about these operations? Lessons learned, best practices, what they can do going forward?
Yeah, so Chris, as you know, we refer to it as Operation Restore Hope, which was our kind of humanitarian assistance into Somalia. The problem was there was a group of bad guys that were kind of stealing the food, that were using food as a weapon. And so the infamous kind of Black Hawk Down incident in Mogadishu in October caused caused us to kind of rethink whether or not we were, in fact, or should get involved in humanitarian assistance. But as I've said before, I think we have to be careful about that narrative. Unfortunately, again, the Clinton administration took away from that, that because of the risk, this is where we lost 18 servicemen in the Black Hawk Down incident. The administration took away from that we have to be very, very careful as we get involved in humanitarian aid around the world or in helping civil conflicts, genocides, as it is in Rwanda. I would almost kind of separate those two issues. So we had a special operation that went horribly wrong, although incredibly heroic on the part of the soldiers as they fought to get their comrades back. Unfortunately, again, we lost a lot of Americans that day. That doesn't mean that the idea of providing humanitarian assistance to the Somalis was wrong. You look at a number of operations we've had over the years, Provide Comfort up in northern Iraq, that fundamentally changed, in a good way, the thinking about the United States of America and provided support to hundreds of thousands of folks. But unfortunately, when you have an incident that is as dramatic and as difficult as it was for Black Hawk Down, it does skew how the public thinks about it. I'll get back to something Congressman McCall said because I think it is important. I'm a big believer in the State Department. If it were up to me, I would grow the State Department to probably 5 times the size it is now. The fact of the matter is, you want great diplomats in places where they can make a difference before you have to send the military in, before we have a civil war, before you have famine that occurs. And what a lot of people don't understand, I think, about the nature of the State Department is it's not just these ambassadors, some of which are political appointees, and it's the first time they've ever stepped into an embassy. It is the rank and file and the career foreign service folks that really make the wheels of progress turn in these countries in which they're in. And they are so well steeped in the culture, in the history, in understanding the problems. So back to my initial comments about how does the military do humanitarian assistance, the reason the first place we go is to the country team is because the men and women who serve on the country team of an ambassador know this country backwards and forwards. They know where the landmines are, both figuratively and literally. And they can help navigate us being the green suitors around the difficulties that we might encounter in a country and make some positive changes. So I think as we look towards the future, again, let's beef up our diplomatic services. You're always going to have the military. I mean, the military has the resources. That's not going to change. We're always going to do humanitarian assistance because we're good at it. But we need to be very thoughtful about it and not, again, to the reform issue of it. Is there some areas where we can reform foreign aid? Absolutely. But I would much rather give foreign aid than have to go fight someplace. And I've had to do that before, so I'm okay with more foreign aid and more diplomacy.
Yeah, and first we lead delegations overseas, and it's great because we have no party label. We're Americans representing the United States, and our first stop is always it's called the in-country team briefing with the ambassador and his team. And he has a team from the chief of station, which is the CIA, to almost every branch of service. And so you get this great sort of briefing before you meet the world leaders about what's going on in that country, what's going on with the governance, what are the hotspot issues, and it's a great education. And I think every major military conflict, though, has started because of a major breakdown in foreign policy, to the Admiral's point. If we don't get the foreign policy right, and you can argue about Vietnam and we can argue about Iraq, but if you don't get it right and you send the military in, you can really screw things up. I think that is you got to get the foreign policy right in the first place. And I think I was in Pakistan meeting with Pakistani businessmen and Indian businessmen. Well, Pakistan and India hate each other, but they were sitting at the table together, and the embassy put it together to really demonstrate that, economic interests can overcome some of these beliefs and belief systems. And I think at the end of the day, it's not going to be the military occupying countries, but rather our economic influence and interests and values that will, at the end of the day, I think, prevail.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.